Hello, friend. Welcome. I'm really glad you're here. Just go ahead, get comfortable, and let yourself unwind. And let the day go, for just a little while. There's a story that we've all heard about the Library of Alexandria and how it was lost. And we've believed most of it our entire lives. It was only when I went looking for what really happened that I understood how little of it holds up, and how much quieter and stranger and sadder the truth turned out to be than the story we tell. And I think that's why this one stayed with me, because the Library of Alexandria was never really a story about a building. It's the story we reach for whenever we think about everything the world has lost, all the books we will never get to read, all the things that people knew once that nobody knows anymore. It's the ache behind one simple question: what did we lose? And how did we really lose it? So tonight, that's where we're going. We'll go back to the real city while it's still young and watch the library rise. We'll meet the kings who built it and the strange, brilliant, very human people who worked inside its walls. And as we go, I'll be honest with you about which parts of this story are solid ground, which parts the scholars still argue about late into the night, which parts turned into legend, and why the legend, in the end, is the part that survived. So settle in, and let me take you back. Almost everyone carries the same picture, though almost no one remembers being handed it. A great hall, somewhere on the coast of Egypt, taller than a temple, its shelves climbing up into shadow, packed with hundreds of thousands of scrolls, the gathered knowledge of the ancient world, all of it in one place. And then the fire, the flames going up the shelves, the scrolls curling and blackening, a whole civilization's memory rising into the night sky as smoke, until the world below was left poorer and darker, and set back by 1,000 years. It is a powerful picture, and almost none of it is true. There was a library at Alexandria, and it was real, and it was extraordinary, and its loss is a real grief. But the great hall, and the one terrible fire, and the 1,000 years of darkness belong to us, not to history. They are a story we told ourselves, much later, to give a clean and bearable shape to something that really happened slowly and quietly across hundreds of years. The Library of Alexandria did not vanish in a single night. It faded, through neglect and politics and damp and plain forgetting, until even the ground it had stood on was lost, and only the picture remained. So this is a story told against the grain of its own legend. We will not get to watch the library burn. We will do something quieter, and in the end more moving. We will go and stand in the real place, and meet the real people, and where the record runs out, as it often will, we will simply say so, and let the not knowing stand. So let us begin where the ground is solid, with the city itself, because the city, at least, is real, and we can stand in it. Picture a flat stretch of Egyptian coast, where the Nile loses itself in the sea, and a new city rising on it out of almost nothing. Long, straight avenues laid down on a surveyor's grid, raw white stone still pale from the quarry, the whole of it turned outward across the Mediterranean, away from old Egypt and toward the Greek world. Alexander the Great had ordered it built in the year 331 before the Common Era, and then died young and far from home without ever seeing it finished. His empire was carved up among his generals, and Egypt fell to a shrewd and careful man named Ptolemy, who made himself king and founded a line of kings that would rule for nearly 300 years, all the way down to the last of them, Cleopatra. The Ptolemies had a particular problem. They were Macedonian Greeks, a few thousand of them, ruling millions of Egyptians in a land far older than their own, whose temples had stood for 2,000 years before Alexander was born. They needed to be more than soldiers. They needed to matter. And so they set out to buy the one thing their gold could not simply seize. They set out to make Alexandria the mind of the Greek world, a place that would outshine even Athens. The library was that ambition made into a building. The idea, the ancients said, came from Athens itself, from the school of Aristotle. The geographer Strabo, who saw Alexandria with his own eyes, wrote that Aristotle was the first man he knew of to gather books, and the first to teach the kings of Egypt how to arrange a library. That cannot be literally true. Aristotle died before Alexandria's library existed, but it points at something real, a line of descent, an idea carried from Aristotle's school in Athens down to the Nile by his students. And in the same breath, Strabo told a small cautionary tale that sits under this whole story like a foundation stone. Aristotle's own books, he wrote, were left to a pupil, and then to that pupil's heirs, ordinary people who did not understand what they had. To hide the books from the collecting agents of a rival king, they buried them in a trench in the ground, where they lay for generations, suffering from damp and moths, until at last they were dug up and sold, and copied carelessly, with the gaps filled in wrong. Hold that image. The very library the Ptolemies set out to imitate was also a warning about how easily books rot and are eaten and are lost when there is no institution to keep them. That is the ending of our story, told at the very beginning, in miniature. There was a reason a king in particular might want a great library, and one of the ancients put it beautifully. The philosopher Demetrius, who advised the first Ptolemy, is said to have told the king to collect and read the books that dealt with kingship and with rule, because, he said, the things that a king's friends dare not tell him to his face are written down honestly in books. It is a lovely thought, and it turns the library into something more than a trophy. A king is surrounded all day by people who want something from him, and who shape every word to please him. The books alone owe him nothing. The library, in that light, was the one courtier in Alexandria who would not lie to the king. But go looking for the moment the library was founded, and the ground gives way underfoot. And this is where the honest fog begins. The ancient tradition credits the second Ptolemy, the one called Philadelphus, and it names the men who worked with him to gather the books. And those men really did live in his reign, so the story is not baseless. And yet, the very same tradition also credits that philosopher Demetrius, the giver of the good advice, and Demetrius makes it impossible. His life was a whole tragedy on its own. He had once ruled the great city of Athens for a Macedonian overlord for 10 years. The Athenians, in their enthusiasm, voted to raise 360 bronze statues of him, nearly one for every day of the year, and had them all cast, it was said, in under 300 days. And then the political wind changed, and the same city tore every one of them down, and melted some of them, it was whispered, into chamber pots. He fled to Egypt, to the first Ptolemy, and helped him build Alexandria into a rival of the Athens that had disgraced him. And then he made one last mistake. When the old king was dying, Demetrius backed the wrong son to inherit the throne. The son who actually won did not forget it. The old philosopher was sent away into internal exile, up the Nile, and there, the story goes, he died, bitten in his sleep, on the hand, by a small, venomous snake. A man who had ruled Athens, undone at last by a snake bite in the Egyptian countryside, destroyed by the very dynasty he had served. And the trouble, for anyone who wants a clean founding story, is that this man died at the very start of the reign of the king he is supposed to have collected books for. The tradition puts a dead man to work. That is how tangled the beginning is. Even the oldest surviving text that talks about the library turns out to be, of all things, a piece of propaganda. It is a letter, supposedly written by a courtier of the second Ptolemy named Aristarchus, except that, as far as anyone can tell, there was no such person as Aristarchus, and the letter was written more than a century after the events it pretends to describe. Its real purpose was religious, to tell a flattering story about how the Hebrew scriptures came to be translated into Greek by 72 Jewish elders summoned to Alexandria. And yet it is this forged letter, this beautiful fiction, that gives us the library's most famous line. The idea that its keeper was given vast sums of money to collect, as far as he possibly could, all the books in the world. All the books in the world. That is the dream of Alexandria, in 6 words. But notice where it comes from. It is not the record of a founding meeting. It is a phrase from a novel written by an anonymous hand 150 years later, telling us not what the library was, but what people had already begun to wish it had been. The dream is older than any fact we can hold. The same forged letter hands us the library's first numbers and its strangest errand. Asked how many books the collection holds, its keeper is made to answer, "More than 200,000, and I shall endeavour before long to gather the rest, until the total reaches 500,000. But the whole reason the letter exists is to explain a single acquisition: the translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. A world library, the story runs, could not call itself complete while the sacred books of the Jews were absent from its shelves, and so the king sent to Jerusalem for 72 learned elders, 6 from each of the 12 tribes, who came down to Alexandria and rendered the ancient law into Greek. That translation was real, and it mattered enormously to the later history of religion. But the tale wrapped around it was written to glorify it, more than 100 years after the fact, which means our oldest source on the library is, from its very first sentence, a document with something to sell. It is a little like trying to reconstruct the founding of a great institution from a legend told by one of its later admirers, who was mostly interested in his own corner of the story. Small wonder the beginning stays a fog. And here we come to the single largest correction in the whole story, the thing that quietly dissolves the picture in everyone's mind. The heart of Alexandria was not called the library. It was called the Mouseion, the shrine of the Muses, the place from which our word museum descends. And it was not, in the first place, a building full of books at all. It was something much stranger, a kind of temple college, a religious community of scholars kept by the king. We have exactly one description of it from someone who was actually there, again the geographer Strabo, in Alexandria a little before the Common Era. The museum, he wrote, was part of the royal palaces. It had a covered walk, and a hall lined with seats, and a large house with a great common dining table, where the learned men who belonged to it ate together. They held their property in common, and they had a priest set over them, appointed in the old days by the king. And now notice what Strabo does not say. He names a walkway, a hall of benches, a dining house. He never once mentions books or shelves or a reading room. Our single eyewitness to the Mouseion describes it without a library in it at all. Because the Mouseion was not the bookshelves, it was the fellowship. A few dozen scholars, appointed for life, fed at the king's table, housed rent-free in the palace quarter, paid a royal salary, and, best of all, exempt from every tax. The books were one department of this larger thing. A man did not visit the Mouseion to read. He was appointed to it, the way one might be given a lifelong chair, or taken into a monastery, and from then on he lived and ate and quarrelled at the pleasure of the king. Not everyone was impressed. A wandering skeptic named Timon, who stood outside the golden cage looking in, wrote the sharpest line anyone ever wrote about the place. "Many are penned and fed," he sneered, in populous Egypt, bookish scribblers endlessly squabbling in the birdcage of the Muses. The birdcage of the Muses. It is a perfect, wicked image, and it catches the paradox at the center of the whole institution. Here were some of the finest minds of the ancient world, and they were also pampered pets, kept birds in a royal coop, fed by the king and doing little, in a rival's eyes, but pecking at one another for his favor. The wonder of Alexandria is that so much that was luminous and lasting was produced by men living in exactly that gilded, dependent, slightly airless way. Extraordinary work, made in a cage. And there is one more thing to say about the Mouseion, and it is the strangest of all. No one can find it. It stood somewhere inside the royal quarter, on the harbour, and that whole quarter is gone, buried under the modern city of Alexandria, or sunk beneath the water of the harbour, where divers today swim over the tumbled stones of drowned palaces. No wall, no floor, no carved inscription has ever been identified, with any certainty, as the library or the Mouseion. When people ask where the ruins of the great library are, the honest answer is that there are none to visit. It was never a grand public monument, only rooms inside a palace that has vanished. And people have wanted a relic so badly that they have reached for things that were never there. For over a century, a block of granite found in Alexandria and carried off to a museum in Vienna was shown, in book after book, as a genuine scroll container from the library. A stone bin, with a hollow cut in it, and a label naming an author and 3 rolls. It was a comforting object, something solid to point to and say, "This touched the library." And it was, almost certainly, nothing of the kind. Most likely the base of a statue, its hollow cut to seat a bust. As one scholar dryly observed, a collection of 500,000 rolls would have needed 160,000 such stone bins, and no one has ever explained how they could have been shelved, or why the thing has no lid. The single object everyone longed to be a piece of the library turned out to be a pedestal for someone's head. Even the relics dissolve when they are held up to the light. There remains the question of how big this fellowship was, and how large its famous collection. The community itself was small, perhaps 30 or 40 or 50 scholars at a time, a single dining hall's worth of men, close and competitive, eating together every night. And the collection? Here we meet the first of the great dreams, the one about size, and it deflates gently in the hand. The ancient numbers are wild and useless. They run from 40,000 books to 700,000, and the same figures turn up in the manuscripts as 40,000 in one copy and 400,000 in the next, 70,000 here and 700,000 there. Round numbers quietly growing a 0 every time a tired scribe copied them. One Roman moralist, Seneca, set the number of books burned at Alexandria at a modest 40,000, and used even that to scold his readers, insisting the collection had been no monument of learning at all, but mere show. Learned luxury, he called it, books gathered not for the sake of reading, but to be displayed, like a rich man's plate. Whatever the true figure, the ancients themselves could not agree whether the library had been a wonder or a vanity. Bagnall, who counted carefully, pointed out something deflating and clarifying at once. If one takes every Greek author known down to the age of Alexandria and gives each of them a generous shelf of scrolls, the total comes to perhaps 30,000 rolls, and probably far fewer. To believe in 500,000 is to believe that almost the entire literature of the Greek world has vanished without leaving a trace, or that the Ptolemies shelved a dozen copies of everything. The likelier truth is that the great Library of Alexandria held something in the low tens of thousands of scrolls. Still, for its day, the largest gathering of books the world had seen, but not the bottomless ocean of the legend. The 500,000 is a dream, a beautiful one, but a dream. Filling even those shelves, though, took a hunger that shaded into theft, and the stories about it are wonderful. with the warning that they come from one late source, a physician named Galen, writing 400 years after. The king, Galen says, was so greedy for books that he gave an order. Every ship that docked in the harbour of Alexandria was to be searched, and any scroll found aboard was to be taken, carried to the library, and copied. The fresh copy was handed back to the traveller. The original was kept and shelved under a label that meant simply, "From the ships." And there is a better story still. The city of Athens kept official master copies of its three great tragedians, the authoritative texts of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, treasured state property. The king of Egypt asked to borrow them, only to copy them, and posted an enormous fortune in silver as a deposit, a guarantee he would return them. Then he had them copied onto the finest papyrus, and kept the originals, and sent Athens the copies, and told the city it could keep the silver too. He simply bought the priceless originals out from under them, and dared them to complain. Galen tells the tale not to praise the library, but to explain how errors and forgeries crept into the texts, the collection's hunger, in the end, corrupting the very books it saved. The Ptolemies did not hunt books in a vacuum. Far to the north, across the sea, a rival dynasty was building a rival library at the city of Pergamon, and the competition between the two grew fierce enough to leave a permanent mark on the history of writing itself. The story, passed down by the Roman scholar Pliny, is that the kings of Egypt, jealous of Pergamon's growing shelves, cut off the export of papyrus, the reed paper of the Nile on which the whole ancient world wrote, in order to starve their rivals of the very material of books. And the Pergamenes, denied papyrus, are said to have perfected another writing surface in its place, finely prepared animal skin, scraped and stretched and smoothed and cut into sheets. We call it parchment to this day, and the word itself is a fossil of that rivalry, for it descends from the name of the city. Whether skin was truly invented then, or only refined, the story catches something real. Two royal libraries locked in a contest so bitter that it changed what books were made of. And the rivalry had a last, strange chapter. Generations later, when Mark Antony had thrown in his lot with Cleopatra, the last of the Ptolemies, it was said, by his enemies, so hold it lightly, that he made her a lover's gift of the whole library of Pergamon, 200,000 volumes carried across the sea to Alexandria. Whether it happened or not, the shape of the tale is telling. Even at the very end, the way to flatter a Ptolemy ran through books by the 100,000. And the reach of the hunt was long. The notes of the old scholars still remember editions of Homer gathered from across the whole Greek world to be compared against one another. A copy from Marseille in the far west, from Chios and Argos and Cyprus, from Sinope on the distant shore of the Black Sea, from Crete. The agents of Alexandria reached from one end of the known world to the other for the text of a single poet, so that the slips of one city's copy could be caught and corrected against another's. But if the library's appetite had a shadow, its scholarship had a light that reaches all the way to us, and this is the part of the story that never really ended. Because the thing the Alexandrians did that outlasted every scroll they owned was to invent, more or less from nothing, the art of caring for a text. Before them, to own a book was to copy it, mistakes and all. The Alexandrians asked a new question, not how to copy a book, but what the author had actually written, and how, across many disagreeing copies, the true words might be recovered again. The first of them was Zenodotus, the first man in Europe we can call a textual critic. Faced with the poems of Homer, surviving in a chaos of variant manuscripts, he did something quietly revolutionary. Where he judged a line to be false, a later insertion, he did not cross it out. He drew a small horizontal stroke in the margin beside it, a mark that said, "I doubt this line." And that mark is one of the great inventions of the human mind, though it looks like nothing. It says, "I will record my doubt, and I will keep the words, so that those who come after can judge for themselves." He did not erase, he annotated. It is the founding gesture of every honest edition ever made since. Those who came after him refined it into something astonishing. One of them, Aristophanes of Byzantium, not the playwright, a scholar of the same name, invented the little marks we still breathe by. As spoken Greek drifted away from its old music, he devised the accent signs to preserve the older pronunciation, and he scattered dots at different heights through the text to mark where a reader should pause and take breath. The distant ancestors of our comma and colon and full stop. The very punctuation that shapes this sentence and lets it be read aloud slowly is a gift in the end from a librarian in Alexandria. He too felt the pull of the cage. The story goes that when he was an old man, the head of the whole library, he was caught preparing to slip away to the rival library at Pergamon, across the sea, and the king had him arrested and held rather than lose his greatest scholar to the competition. Even the librarians could not simply leave. And the greatest of them was Aristarchus of Samothrace, a name worth holding carefully because there is another Aristarchus coming, and they are forever confused. This one was the master of the critical edition. He built a whole quiet language of marginal signs, one mark for a line he thought false, another for a line he wanted to discuss, another where his reading differed from Xenodotus's before him, and each sign in the poem pointed the reader to a matching note in a separate book of commentary. A symbol in the text, sending the reader to an explanation kept elsewhere. That is the ancestor of the footnote and of every scholarly apparatus since. His rule for understanding Homer was to explain Homer out of Homer, to reconstruct the poet's meaning from the poet's own words, plainly read, rather than decoding it into secret allegories, as others love to do. It is the direct forefather of careful reading itself, and through it all, he kept the cardinal Alexandrian discipline. He marked perhaps 800 lines of the Iliad as doubtful. He deleted none of them. That restraint is the reason we can still read the very lines he distrusted and make up our own minds, 23 centuries later. The library's editors were not censors, they were keepers of doubt. A philosopher of the age called Aristarchus a kind of seer, a diviner, so unerringly did he seem to strike the truth, and his name became, forever after, the word for the perfect and severe critic. There is one judgment of theirs that still gives a small, strange shiver to anyone who loves the Odyssey. The great scholars of Alexandria, weighing the poem line by line, came to believe that Homer's true Odyssey ended at a particular verse near the close, the quiet moment when Odysseus and his wife Penelope, reunited at last after 20 years of war and wandering, go together to their bed, and that everything after it, the last few hundred lines, was a later hand's addition, sewn on by someone else long afterward. It is a purely internal judgment, made on the feel and the grain of the verse, and scholars argue about it to this very day. But notice once again what they did with their doubt. They believed the poem's real ending had been buried beneath a false one, and they kept every line of that false ending anyway, marked but never cut, so that the whole poem still comes down to us entire, and anyone can stand where they stood and wonder for themselves where the story of Odysseus truly comes to rest. Here is the quiet miracle of it, the thing worth carrying out of this whole movement into the dark. Almost everything we know of Aristarchus's work survives by the narrowest thread imaginable. 4 later scholars copied down pieces of his learning, and those pieces were later squeezed into the margins of a single Byzantine manuscript, copied out by hand 1,000 years after he lived, one book that happened to survive. The greatest textual scholarship of the ancient world reaches us through the eye of a needle. A few commentators, crammed into the margins of one medieval codex that did not burn or rot or get lost. When we read Homer today, We are reading in part through the eyes of a librarian who worked in Alexandria before Rome was an empire. That thread never broke. That is what survived. While some of them saved the words of the poets, others turned the same patient attention on the world itself and measured it. Euclid worked in Alexandria around the beginning of it all and wrote the book of geometry that became the most successful textbook in the history of the human race, taught almost unchanged for 2,000 years. Little is certain about his life, but one exchange has come down to us from a writer 7 centuries later, so take it as a fond tradition rather than a fact. The king, the story goes, grew impatient with the long chains of proofs and asked Euclid whether there was not some quicker way to learn geometry, some shortcut fit for a king. And Euclid answered, "There is no royal road to geometry. No shortcut, not even for a king. The mind must walk the whole path itself, step by proven step." But the most beautiful piece of reasoning to come out of Alexandria belonged to a librarian named Eratosthenes, who, with nothing but shadows and a mind, measured the size of the earth. He had heard that far to the south, at a town called Mouseion, on one particular day of the year, the noon of the summer solstice, the sun stood so exactly overhead that its light reached all the way to the bottom of a deep well, and a standing pillar cast no shadow at all. He knew that on that same day, at that same hour, in Alexandria to the north, a vertical pillar did cast a shadow. And from that single difference, the shadow in one city and no shadow in the other, he reasoned his way to the whole. He measured the angle of the Alexandrian shadow and found it to be about 1/50th of a full circle. If the sun's rays fell in parallel across the curved earth, then the two cities must be 1/50th of the way around the entire globe apart. He knew the distance between them. He multiplied it by 50. And the number he reached for the circumference of the earth was, depending on exactly which measure he used, within a few percent of the truth we know today from satellites, the size of the whole planet, worked out in the 3rd century before the Common Era, from the length of a shadow and the geometry of a mind. His book is lost. The method survives because a later astronomer wrote it down, and it remains, perhaps, the loveliest thing the library ever did. Not a scroll saved, but a way of thinking that needed nothing but a stick in the ground and the courage to reason from it. And Eratosthenes was far more than that single measurement. He was a geographer who drew the known world, and a mathematician, and a poet, and a chronologist who tried to fix the dates of the whole human past into one great order. So wide-ranging in his gifts that his rivals are said to have given him a faintly cruel nickname, Beta, the second letter of the Greek alphabet, meaning that he was second best at everything and first at nothing. It was unkind, and it missed the point, for to be second in all the world at that many things at once is its own rare kind of genius. He left behind, too, a small and elegant trick for sifting out the prime numbers, the numbers divisible by nothing but themselves and 1. A simple method that strains them cleanly out of all the others, and it is still called the sieve of Eratosthenes, and it is still shown to schoolchildren today, more than 2,000 years after he set it down. There was even, walking the same halls, a man who guessed the shape of the cosmos itself. And this is the second Aristarchus, Aristarchus of Samos, the astronomer, not to be confused with the Homer scholar we just left. His book, too, is lost, but the great Archimedes preserved its heart. Aristarchus had proposed, he wrote, that the fixed stars and the sun do not move, and that it is the earth that travels in a circle around the sun, with the sun resting at the center of its orbit. The sun at the center, and the earth going round it. 1,800 years before Copernicus would be remembered for the same idea. Aristarchus even grasped that the stars must be so unimaginably far away that the Earth's whole vast orbit was, next to that distance, no more than a point. He was right, and it did not matter. The idea was understood and set aside, partly for a sound reason, because no one could detect the tiny shift in the stars that a moving Earth should cause, and partly for a darker one, because a philosopher of the day held that Aristarchus ought to be charged with impiety for daring to set the hearth of the universe in motion. And so the true shape of the heavens was seen once, clearly, in Alexandria, and then it closed over again and slept for 18 centuries. Sometimes the world is not ready to keep what it has found, and some of them turn that same unflinching gaze upon the human body. And here the light of Alexandria falls across a shadow which the honest telling cannot skip, but which we can speak of gently. A physician named Herophilus, working in the early days of the city, carried out the first careful studies of human anatomy in the recorded history of the world. He was the first to understand that the nerves were not the blood vessels, and that the brain, not the heart, was the seat of thought and sensation. He traced the delicate structures of the eye and named parts of the body that still, today, carry the name he gave them. He was the first, it seems, to think of timing the beat of the pulse, counting it against the steady drip of a water clock. And he did not work alone. A colleague, Eratosthenes, bent the same unflinching attention on the heart and on the vessels that carry the blood through the body, so that between the two of them, the hidden interior of a living creature was brought, for the first time in history, into daylight. It was a genuine dawn, the body seen clearly from the inside for the first time. But there is a claim attached to this work, from a Roman writer more than a century later, that its darkest studies were carried out upon condemned prisoners handed over, still living, by the kings. It is a hard thing to read, and it is worth being careful about, because that late writer is nearly our only source, and scholars have long argued over how much of it, if any, truly happened. What we can say quietly is this: the same royal power that fed the poets and paid for the star charts could also turn its gift to darker use, and the pursuit of knowledge in Alexandria, for all its light, was not free of a shadow. We can let that sit, soberly, and pass on, as the ancient writer who reported it thought the practice cruel, and said so. Because the deeper truth about the library is that its scholars, for all their brilliance, were never free. They were the kings, and the king could turn on them. More than a century before any Roman set foot in Alexandria, the golden cage was rattled hard. A later Ptolemy, a cruel and heavy man his own people nicknamed Potbelly, seized the city in a dynastic war, and among his acts of vengeance, he expelled the entire community of scholars, the philologists, the geometers, the physicians, the philosophers, the teachers, driving them out of Alexandria altogether. The great Aristarchus, the master of the critical text, fled to the island of Cyprus, an old man, and there, sick and in exile, he is said to have starved himself to death. And here the story does something that is almost consoling. One of those driven out remarked that the expulsion, terrible as it was, carried Greek learning out into all the world, because the scattered scholars, cast out of their cage, settled in Athens and Rhodes and Pergamon, and taught there, and lit lamps in a dozen cities that had been dark. So the golden age of Alexandria did not end in a fire at all. It ended in a tyrant's purge, and the birds of the Muses' cage, driven out into the night, carried their small flames to everywhere else. This was a full 100 years before Julius Caesar was even born. And now, at last, we come to the famous fire, and to the beginning of the long mystery of who, in the end, destroyed the library. A mystery in which nearly every accused party turns out to be innocent, or half innocent, or already too late to matter. The first fire is Caesar's. In the year 48 before the Common Era, Julius Caesar, chasing his rival across the Mediterranean, found himself trapped in Alexandria in the middle of yet another Ptolemaic family war, besieged in the palace quarter with too few men. To keep the enemy fleet from cutting him off, he set fire to the ships in the harbour. And here is the first surprise. Caesar himself wrote an account of that war, and in it he describes the burning of the fleet and the fire spreading among the buildings by the docks, and he never mentions a library at all. His own silence is the first clue. The story that the great library burned that night comes to us from Plutarch, writing a century and a half later in a single sentence, that the fire spread from the dockyards and destroyed the great library. One sentence, long after the fact, is the root of the whole legend. But another ancient historian, describing the same fire, is more precise and more revealing. What burned, he says, were the dockyards and the storehouses near the harbour, the warehouses where grain and books were kept, not the Mouseion, not the great library in the palace, warehouses at the water's edge where newly arrived scrolls were piled before they were ever carried up and catalogued. What most likely burned in Caesar's fire, then, was a great stack of scrolls waiting in harbour storerooms, a real and painful loss, but a shipment, not a civilization. And we have the proof that the library itself survived, because our one eyewitness, the geographer Strabo, walked through the working Mouseion a full generation later and found it going about its business, and gave no hint that it had ever burned. Whatever the fire took, the library outlived it. The headline that Caesar burned the Library of Alexandria is a true event, compressed and enlarged across the centuries into something it never was. After Caesar, the story is not a fire but a fading, the slow, undramatic death that is how almost everything ancient actually died. The Ptolemies gave way to Roman rule, and the Mouseion, which had lived entirely on the will of kings, became a lesser thing under emperors who cared for it less. Its privileges were trimmed. The palace quarter where it stood was heavily damaged in a later war between a Roman emperor and a desert queen. By the 3rd century of the Common Era, the community of scholars fades from the record altogether, not with a scream, but with a silence, the endowment thinning, the appointments ceasing, the great table emptying, until there was no one left to feed. There had been a second library too, in another quarter of the city, a smaller collection housed at the temple of the god Serapis, sometimes called the Daughter Library. And when a historian of the 4th century mentions its books, he does something quietly telling. He speaks of them in the past tense, as of something already gone. By his own day, it seems, the Daughter Library's shelves were already empty, or nearly so. Which brings us to another moment the legend loves to blame. The year 391, and the destruction of that temple of Serapis. In that year, the Christian Patriarch of Alexandria, backed by an imperial order against the old pagan worship, led a crowd to tear down the temple of Serapis, and to smash its colossal statue of the god, and to hold the broken idols up to public ridicule. It was a real and violent turning point, the fall of one of the great pagan shrines of the ancient world. But read the accounts written closest to the event, some by people who had actually seen the temple standing, and they describe in vivid detail the pulling down of the building and the breaking of the statue. And they say nothing at all about a library or the burning of books. The idea that the Library of Alexandria was destroyed in that year is a later inference, laid over the fact that a library had once stood there generations before. The most honest reconstruction is quieter and sadder than the picture of monks torching scrolls. Whatever books the temple had once held were most likely long gone, dispersed or decayed before the crowd ever arrived. What fell that day was a temple and an age of the gods, not a library, because the library was already a memory. And there is one more figure the legend has made into the last martyr of the library, and she deserves to be told truly and gently, and with her death kept at a distance. Her name was Hypatia, and she was, around the turn of the 5th century, one of the most admired minds in Alexandria. A mathematician and astronomer and teacher of philosophy, the daughter of a mathematician who lectured publicly and was respected across the city. She lived in a time of bitter factional struggle between the Roman governor and the city's patriarch, and she became somehow caught in the middle of it. And in the spring of the year 415, she was killed, set upon by a mob in the streets, in the heat of that political and religious feud, and murdered. It was a monstrous act, and it is worth saying that the historian who recorded it, writing within a generation, and himself a Christian, condemned it without reserve. He wrote that it brought the deepest disgrace upon the whole Church of Alexandria, and that nothing could be further from the spirit of his faith than murder of that kind. But she was not the last librarian, and her death did not destroy the library, because there was no great library left to destroy. It had faded generations before she was born. She was killed in a struggle for power, not for her learning. The later ages that made her the shining symbol of reason murdered by fanaticism were reaching, understandably, for a martyr. But the truth is at once simpler and darker. A brilliant woman destroyed by the politics of a violent city. Let her be a person, and not only a symbol, and let the grief of it rest quietly. And so, at last, to the final legend, the one that blames the very end. And it is the easiest of all to lay to rest, which makes it a gentle place to arrive. The story is that when the Arab armies took Alexandria in the year 642, their general asked the caliph, far away, what should be done with the city's great library. And the caliph is supposed to have answered, if these books agree with the book of God, they are not needed. And if they disagree, they are not wanted. So destroy them. And the scrolls, the tale says, were fed into the furnaces of the city's public baths, and there were so many of them that they heated the bathwater of Alexandria for 6 months. It is a vivid story. It is also, almost certainly, entirely false. It appears for the first time some 600 years after the conquest in a chronicle of the 13th century, and not one of the many writers in the 6 centuries between ever mentions it. It has the telltale shape of a wandering legend, the same clever, grim logic told of other conquests and other books. And it runs aground on the simplest fact of all. By the year 642, there was no great Library of Alexandria left to burn. It had been gone, in truth, for centuries. The conquest did not destroy the library, because the library was already a ghost, and naming that gently, setting the 6 months of bath fires quietly aside, is one of the small, satisfying honesties this whole story has to offer. And so we come, at the last, to what was truly lost. Here the legend makes its largest claim, and here it is weakest. The picture says the fire set human knowledge back 1,000 years, and cost us cures and inventions we can only mourn. But if the collection was in the tens of thousands of scrolls, not the millions, and if the things that mattered most existed in copies scattered across the whole Mediterranean, in Athens and Rhodes and Pergamon and Rome, then no single fire, real or imagined, could ever have erased them. Most of what the library held was lost the way nearly all ancient writing was lost, not in one catastrophe, but through the endless, soft attrition of the centuries. Papyrus is fragile, and Egypt near the sea is damp. A book survived only if someone, in every generation, chose to copy it out again by hand before the old copy crumbled, and the books that no one troubled to recopy simply dissolved, quietly, into dust and silence, unremembered. The Library of Alexandria did not so much burn as fade, along with almost everything else the ancient world ever wrote. That is the real loss, and it is larger and quieter than any fire. And yet, and this is where the story turns at the very end toward the light, something did survive, and it survived because of Alexandria. Not a collection, a method. The way we still read carefully and edit honestly and mark our doubts without erasing the words. The footnote and the commentary and the whole patient discipline of asking what an author really wrote. All of it was born in that birdcage of the Muses, and all of it is still in use in every serious book made since. Our Homer comes to us shaped by Alexandrian hands. Euclid's geometry and Eratosthenes' way of measuring the world from a shadow, and the very idea of a place where knowledge is gathered and cared for and passed on, the university, the encyclopedia, the museum that still carries the Muses' name. These are Alexandria's true and living children. The library gave us less a set of books than a way of keeping them. And there is a small, wry grace note waiting at the very end. In our own century, on the shore at Alexandria, not far from where the old one is thought to have stood, a great new library has been raised. A vast, tilted disc of glass and grey stone, built to honour the memory of the lost one, and named, in the old tongue, the Bibliotheca Alexandrina. And the same patient scholar who spent a career gently deflating the legend could not, in the end, resist one last observation: that its beautiful, humming, book-lined reading hall is, after all this time, a worthy successor to the Muses' birdcage. The old joke, 2,000 years old, settles softly onto its perch one more time. The legend says, one great hall, one villain, one fire, 1,000 years of dark. The evidence says, a small fellowship of pampered, quarrelling, brilliant scholars in a palace that has vanished so completely we cannot find its floor. A collection we can no longer measure, a decline spread thin across 700 years, and, in the end, no single fire at all. And still, this is the strange and gentle thing, the legend is not simply a lie, it is true to a real grief. The ancient world's writing really was mostly lost. We really do read only a small, flickering fraction of what the Greeks once wrote. That ache the picture gives us, of a vast and luminous store of human knowledge slipping away through our fingers, that ache is honest. It just did not happen in a night. It happened the way most loss happens, slowly, and without anyone deciding, until one day the thing is simply gone, and only the wish for it remains. The Library of Alexandria, in the end, is the name we have given to everything we have ever lost and wished we had not. It is why the picture will not leave us, and why, in our imagining, it never quite stops burning. And there is a kind of peace in seeing it clearly at last, the real place, the real people, the honest and ordinary way that even the greatest things are lost, and in letting the old grief settle and grow quiet and finally rest. And that is where I'll leave it. Thank you for keeping me company tonight. If you are still awake and this one stayed with you, I would be glad to know of it. A review if you are moved to leave one, a suggestion for a story you would like told, a gentle correction if I have gotten something wrong. But none of it is for now. It can keep until morning. There is nothing left to do. Let the room stay quiet and let yourself rest. I will be here when you would like another.